Hello, welcome to our Reader's Advisory for Classic Modern Novels. I'm Perry DeRose, a library associate with Prince George's County Memorial Library System. First, I want to state that I am not a professor of literature at a prestigious university, nor an acclaimed literary critic. I have zero credentials for this presentation, except that I am a writer of 9 novels who has always had a strong interest in and love for modern classic novels. These are the works that taught me how to write. They were my inspiration and teachers and set my standard for quality literature. During this presentation, I will use dubbed voices to read the critiques because they are clearer and more amiable to the ears than my voice, which was impaired by surgery, an annoying fate. The image I now present is one of my digital artworks that I feel expresses aspects of our modern age.
The novels I chose are not only classics, but iconic. They helped illuminate and define the modern world of the 20th and 21st centuries. What were some of the characteristics of this time period? It was an age of manufacturing and technology, electronic and digital. It was an era of the individual more than the collective, except in socialist states. It was the triumph of the anti-hero and the rise of the woman. It challenged all forms of oppression and inequality. It spawned an awakening in spiritual consciousness, and an embracing of world cultures and religions, especially Eastern, with Qi and Qi practices, meditation and yoga. The doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley stated. It witnessed a bold flourishing of the arts including television, movies, and digital, and a huge revolution in the visual arts, from Cézanne to 3D animation. It hosted the rise of the middle class, the bourgeoisie. And it spawned exciting new literature. But it was also plagued by devastating world wars and often senseless, smaller conflicts. It was the age of the alienated, estranged human, near-epidemic addiction, pronounced mental illnesses, medication as a panacea, marriage and family dysfunction, and horrific virus pandemics. A time of contrasts. There are many significant modern novels. I selected 7.
Let us begin with Hearts of Darkness, a novella, a short novel written in 1902 by British author Joseph Conrad.
On a docked ship, seaman Charles Marlowe tells friends his story of piloting a ship down a treacherous, African Congo River in search of the ivory trader Mr. Kurtz, who has vanished with the company's ivory and money. As he ventures deeper, the jungle becomes more primitive and dangerous, and the stories of Kurtz at dockings more mystifying and shocking. He finally reaches the domain of the brilliant and talented Kurtz, who reigns like a mad, ill king, feared and worshipped by his native workers. He lives in a home surrounded by the decapitated heads on poles of his adversaries. Kurtz is a complex and tortured man, a contemporary expression of the classic, tragic figure who sells his soul for power and a misguided self-realization. Lured and repelled by hypnotic, primitive rituals and Kurtz's expressions of creative brilliance, Marlowe struggles with conflicting impulses in his soul. This thrilling, haunting, and often surreal novella is a searing indictment of imperialistic colonialism, exploitation, and racism, and can also be viewed as a metaphor of a voyage beneath the cultured veneer of civilized man into a savage and brutal core, and a man's descent into madness. Kurtz's final words are among the most famous in literature. The horror, the horror. In recent decades, the story has been criticized by some for depicting a simplistic, racist view of the indigenous people and culture of the African Congo. But it is also true that the story rages against the exploitation of those people. Most of all, this stylistically brilliant story is of a journey into the dark heart of an unbridled, human self. The story was the basis of Francis Ford Coppola's film Apocalypse Now in 1979, set in the Vietnam War. An excerpt: I tried to break the spell, the heavy, mute spell of the wilderness, that seemed to draw Kurtz to its pitiless breast by the awakening of forgotten and brutal instincts, by the memory of gratified and monstrous passions. This alone, I was convinced, had driven him out to the edge of the forest, to the bush, towards the gleam of fires, the throb of drums, the drone of weird incantations. This alone had beguiled his unlawful soul beyond the bounds of permitted aspirations.
The next book is The Metamorphosis, written by German Franz Kafka in 1912. If ever a book was an iconic expression of the awakening modern world, man as a cog in the machine, a mere non-entity, this was it.
The Metamorphosis presents the tale of Gregor Samsa, an ordinary, common man, a harried, workaholic salesman obedient to his obligations at the beginning of the 20th century. He awakens one morning to a dismaying surprise. He has been transformed into a huge, monstrous insect, like a cockroach. Samsa, who lives with and supports his parents and sister, struggles to comprehend his plight, and to find a way that he can yet exist with some connection and meaning. His family must tend to him, which spirals into pity, abuse, and a final decision to get rid of it. Samsa, the insect. And yet Samsa manages to achieve some redemption, some hope, in a beautiful violin solo performed by his sister, Greta, and the presence, and need, of honest love for his family that yet dwells deep in his being, including his acceptance of his death by starvation as a sacrifice to relieve them of their burden. Disturbingly, Samsa appears to understand, and accept, his hideous condition, although Kafka does not explain what he understands. That is for the reader to interpret. This story is often perceived as a brilliant metaphor, and my interpretation is that Samsa was a man who repeatedly betrayed his integrity, his true being and purpose, hour after hour, day after day, dismissing it to a facade of obligation and propriety, the well-adjusted man, until all that was left was a shell of himself, an insect. Perhaps many today face this dilemma. But do not despair. We probably will not need to awaken in the form of an insect, for we are spared that by the bold, creative work of Kafka. He confronted it for us. What might be your thought? An excerpt? One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armor-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it, and seemed about to slide off at any moment. His many legs, pitifully slim compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about restlessly as he looked. What has happened to me? He thought. It wasn't a dream.
Few Americans had heard of German writer Hermann Hesse until his experimental novel, Steppenwolf, became a favorite of the hippie counterculture in the 1960s. This is one of my favorite novels. They identified with its protagonist's struggle with his conflicting nature and his drug-enhanced adventure in the magic theater. The rock band Steppenwolf, born to be wild, took their name from this book.
Written in 1927, Steppenwolf unfolds the story of Harry Heller, a middle-aged, intellectual writer who thinks of himself as a wolf of the steppes. He abhors the bourgeois middle-class society, of which he is a part, considering them frivolous, superficial, and materialistic. He yearns for the company of the immortals Mozart and Goethe, and is contemplating suicide. On lonely prowls through the night city, he encounters illusion doors and signs with the words, "The Magic Theatre, for Madmen only." He's given a book, the treatise on the Steppenwolf, which depicts his story. A man conflicted by two natures, the spiritual, and the animalistic, who denies his immense complexities. Then Harry meets Hermine, a lovely, free-spirited woman, a courtesan, who is his opposite. She lures him into a world of sensual pleasures, indulgences, jazz, dancing, and romance. With the companion Pablo, a jazz saxophonist, and a narcotic drug, Harry ventures into the magic theatre, where each room presents an aspect of his self or a fantasy of his mind. The war between man and machine, a playful encounter with Mozart, mirrors of his life. These courageous confrontations bring Harry to some transcendence and healing. An excerpt. Harry Heller is in the magic theatre. And everywhere on all the countless doors were the inscriptions. Mutabor, transformation into any animal or plant you please. Kamasutran, instruction into the Indian art of love. 42 different methods and practices. Delightful suicide, you laugh yourself to bits. Do you want to be all spirit? The wisdom of the East. Downfall of the West, moderate prices, never surpassed. Compendium of art, transformation of time into space by means of music. Laughing tears, cabinet of humor. Solitude made easy, complete substitute for all forms of sociability. The series of inscriptions was endless. One was, guidance in the building of personality. Success guaranteed. This seemed to me worth looking into, and I went in at this door. Hermann Hesse also later wrote the popular Siddhartha, based on the life of Buddha.
French author and philosopher Albert Camus wrote The Stranger in 1942. He was one of the founding voices of the modern philosophy, existentialism. Emerging after World War I, the existentialists believed that life was essentially absurd, lacking an overseeing God or any inherent meaning. Camus urged people to accept that and rebel by rejoicing in what life does offer. Man was the creator of his experiences and destiny, and needed to forge his own moral code.
These principles infuse the story of Meursault, a Frenchman living in Algiers. The opening lines are famous: "Mother died today." Or maybe it was yesterday. I don't know. Meursault displays an emotionless, detached nature as he attends his mother's funeral. The next day he begins an erotic liaison with Marie. Days after, on a beach, a friend is slashed by an Arab over a violent episode involving a sister. Later, alone on the beach, Meursault encounters the Arab, who approaches him. With the sun blinding Meursault, in a confused, hot moment, the Arab flashes his knife, and Meursault shoots him, hesitates, then 4 more times with a pistol he took for protection. Meursault is interrogated, arrested, and tried for murder. At his trial, the prosecution presents Meursault's lack of remorse and emotion, his failure to weep at his mother's funeral, his atheism, his irresponsible relationship with Marie, and his weak self-defense, depicting him as a soulless monster. Meursault is shocked when the judge convicts him of murder with malice, and sentences him to death by the guillotine. In prison, Awaiting execution and the decision of his appeal, he reviews his life, and feels seething anger against the people who judge and condemn him for being the person he chooses. A chaplain visits and attempts to turn him from his atheism, but Merceau rages at him over the absurdity of the human condition, and the meaninglessness of existence, and then accosts him. Merceau finally accepts his impending execution, and finds a happiness in his indifference towards the world, and the fact that a hateful crowd will bring an end to his loneliness. He does not compromise. An excerpt. During Merceau's trial, only one incident stands out. Towards the end, as my counsel rambled on, I heard the tin trumpet of an ice cream vendor in the street, a small shrill sound cutting across the flow of words. Then a rush of memories went through my mind. Memories of a life which was mine no longer and had once provided me with their surest, humblest pleasures. Warm smells of summer, my favorite streets, the sky at evening, Maria's dresses and her laugh. The futility of what was happening here seemed to take me by the throat. Albert Camus became a national hero when he fought with the French underground resistance against the Nazis in WW2. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957. His death at age 47 is often seen as darkly ironic, dying in a crash in his sports car, killed by a cold, heartless machine.
When F. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby in 1925, he gave to history its most iconic and definitive account of the 1920s, an age or decade known as the Roaring Twenties. Following the profound disillusionment of World War I and the lost generation, it was a reactionary time of extravagance, boundless indulgence, the economic boom of post-war America.
Nick Calloway, a Yale graduate selling bonds, moves into a small house in Long Island, New York. His neighbor, Gatsby, a rags-to-riches tycoon, lives in a mansion where every Saturday, a wild, glitzy, extravagant party of jazz, drinking, and dancing is hosted, the new money crowd attending. Nick visits his cousin, Daisy, a child of the American wealthy elite, who lives across the lake from him. There he connects with the female golf champion Jordan Baker. Weeks later, they and Daisy's rich and brutish husband, Tom Buchanan, and his secret mistress, drive to New York City where they indulge in a night of drunken abandon. Nick hears scandalous rumors about the mysterious tycoon Gatsby, who is depicted like a mythic god, and one night meets him at his dazzling mansion party. Gatsby is magnetic and gracious, and persuades Nick to arrange a meeting between Gatsby and Daisy. At that luncheon, a romantic saga unfolds. Gatsby and Daisy had been in love 5 years earlier, and underlying all of Gatsby's triumphs was his determined plan to reconcile with Daisy, his soul's only love. He built an empire for her. Their romance reignites and desperate subterfuge follow. Nick is lured deeper into Gatsby's amazing world and works for him. He discovers corruption involving bootlegging, but Gatsby is a visionary idealist, and has an extraordinary gift for hope that Nick finds admirable. Gatsby and Daisy's fantastic romance unfurls madly, descending into inevitable tragic consequences involving a fatal accident, betrayal, and murder. Gatsby's downfall and his idealistic but doomed romance appears to foretell the eventual collapse of the American dream of boundless wealth and power in a morally vacuous world, titans destroyed by extravagant dreams. Nick moves back to the simpler Midwest, disillusioned and disgusted with life in the East, and a future one can never grasp yet always reaches for. An excerpt. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic, their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face but, instead, from a pair of enormous, yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently, some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground.
George Orwell published 1984 in 1948. Together with Brave New World, it was one of the first dystopian future novels. It has had such a huge impact on world culture that some of its terms, like Big Brother, referring to oppressive government surveillance and control, has become part of our modern lexicon. Big Brother is watching you. Also, the terms thought crime, newspeak, and the adjective Orwellian, which designates a political mind control and government manipulation.
Set in a future 1984, the world is divided into three superstates which are constantly at war: Eurasia, Eastasia, and Oceania, where the story is set, which includes the Western Hemisphere and Britain. It's a totalitarian state of mind control and propaganda led by a mysterious Big Brother who has a broad cult of personality, although it is not known if he truly exists. This regime utilizes thought police and telescreens, two-way TVs, to root out any who do not subscribe to their beliefs, who then are erased and disappear. The state exists for its power alone. The story's protagonist is Winston Smith, who works at the Ministry of Truth, creating altered versions of history and current events to support the teachings of the regime. He secretly despises Big Brother and its party, but harbors no hope of any social/political change. He has a torrid, secret love affair with his co-worker Julia, and is lured to the teachings of a rumored underground resistance group, the Brotherhood. Winston acquaints various mysterious and accomplished people who present themselves as members of this resistance but are actually Ministry thought police agents. He is arrested and imprisoned, where he is starved and tortured until his thinking aligns with that of the state. Then he is taken to room 101, where he is tormented by that which he most fears until he betrays Julia. He is finally released back into the community, and where he accepts that he loves Big Brother. Winston is now of the state. The operations, practices, and devices of the Big Brother regime are depicted in the novel in chilling details, often reminding the reader of nation-states and government practices that have and do exist in our modern world. Novel excerpts: The Ministry of Truth, Minitru in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up, terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood it was just possible to read, picked out on its white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. You could not create such a world as you have just described. It is a dream. It is impossible. Why? It is impossible to found a civilization on fear and hatred and cruelty. It would never endure. Why not? It would have no vitality. It would disintegrate. It would commit suicide. Nonsense.
Our last novel, The Color Purple, was written by Black American author Alice Walker in 1982.
In a preface to an edition of The Color Purple, Ms. Walker depicts the novel as a woman's epic odyssey from a child of religious teachings to a mature, independent, African-American woman of spiritual realization. The feminist story is epistolary, written in the format of letters to God. Set in early 20th century rural Georgia, two sisters, Celie and Nettie, struggle through numerous traumatic or oppressive relationships with men, a father and husbands, and binds with other often exploited women. They become separated by time and distance and a need for silence, yet always maintaining their loyalty to and faith in each other. Treading through their lives are colorful characters including Shug, a blues singer, Sophia, the abusive father Alfonso, widowed Mr. Blank, her son Adam, and the African girl Toshi, each victims and survivors of often heartless social and cultural traditions. The novel painfully reveals the truths of domestic and sexual abuse as it celebrates the power of struggle, companionship, spiritual awakening, and faith. Celie, who finally is reunited with 2 children she long thought were dead, evolves into a successful businesswoman of character, empowerment, and love. The story is written in a Black English vernacular that expresses educational limitations, while endowing it with a potent authenticity. Malcolm X said, "The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman." This novel explores that tragedy and a Black woman who triumphs over it. An excerpt spoken by Sophia. Tilda she say, "All my life I had to fight. I had to fight my daddy. I had to fight my brothers. I had to fight my cousins and my uncles. A girl child ain't safe in a family of men. But I never thought I'd have to fight in my own house." She let out her breath. "I loves Harpo," she say. "God knows I do. But I'll kill him dead before I let him beat me. Now if you want a dead son-in-law you just keep advising him like you do." The novel won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. It was adapted into a movie by Steven Spielberg in 1985 starring Danny Glover, Whoopi Goldberg, and Oprah Winfrey.
This concludes our survey of modern classic novels. I hope you enjoyed it and are motivated to read one of these or other great works. All of the novels presented are available through our library website and catalog. I did not include later 20th century or 21st century novels because I believe that should be a separate presentation with its own parameters. I hope you will be joyous and safe in these challenging times. I leave you with this quote from author Maxine Hong Kinston. "We're all under the same sky and walk the same earth. We're alive together during the same moment." Thank you. Goodbye.